Chapter 6. By Friday morning, there were berries in baskets all over the kitchen, and Jessica planned to get the sugar she needed to make jam. Lots and lots of jam. The kids always seemed to want to take jam sandwiches for their lunches, and she wanted to experiment with raspberry apple butter. As soon as the older children left for school, George hitched the wagon for their trip into town. Jessica held the baby, and Joe sat in the back of the wagon, happy to be going along for the ride. When they reached town, George helped her from the wagon, which was truly the first time he'd shown her real manners. He took the baby, told Joe to stay where he was, and walked into the store with her. Mr. Gunderson was behind the counter, and George quickly introduced Jessica. "Gunderson, this is my new wife, Jessica. I want her to be able to charge whatever she needs." Mr. Gunderson smiled and nodded. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Fleming." "It's good to meet you as well." Before she knew what was happening, George had left the store, and she was left to peruse and ask for what she needed. "I need 20 pounds of sugar, 50 pounds of flour, and butter to start with." They'd just run out of butter, and though there was a churn, she felt her time was better used in other ways. "Yes, of course. I'll mark those on your tab and carry the supplies to the wagon. Let me know what else you need." In a cold case, she found chicken, beef, and pork. She chose sausage and bacon as well as chicken and beef for meals coming up. Then she turned to the yard goods, choosing a pretty yellow fabric for Nancy's church dress. She chose buttons and thread to go with it and stopped momentarily when she saw a sewing machine. Her mother had one, and she loved it, but she felt George wouldn't be pleased if she made such a large purchase. When Mr. Gunderson returned to the store, he saw her stroking the machine. "You should get it," he said. "George has quite a credit with us. That machine would make your life so much easier." Jessica bit her lip. She wanted it, but she didn't feel right spending so much. "I'll go and talk to George about it," she finally said. As soon as she stepped outside, George frowned at her. "Are you finished?" "No, I wanted to ask you something." "Oh?" "There's a sewing machine in the store. I used one back east, and it made sewing so much less of a chore. I could finish a dress in a day with the machine, and there's no way I could do that without." She took a deep breath, prepared for his wrath. "Could I possibly buy the machine? I know they're expensive, but—" "How expensive?" he asked. He didn't seem angry to Jessica, so she continued. "This one is $45. Mr. Gunderson told me to just get it, but I couldn't without talking to you first." George was still as he thought for a moment. "I think that would be all right. We have plenty of credit there." He was standing beside the wagon, holding the baby and talking to little Joe. Without thinking, Jessica flung her arms around her husband. "Oh, thank you." George looked stunned when he pulled back, and Jessica was terribly embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled, hurrying back into the store. Once inside, she smiled at Mr. Gunderson, trying to block out the way she'd felt pressed up against George. "I'll buy the sewing machine, and everything else on the counter, please." "You're making a good choice, Mrs. Fleming. That machine will save you countless hours." "Yes, it will." She pursed her lips. "Canning jars? I'll be making jam and applesauce this coming week." "Oh, yes, ma'am." Mr. Gunderson walked to the back room and produced 3 jars. "Which size?" "I would like some of each if that's all right." He nodded. "I'll give you a box of each size. After this, you can just get the seals and not pay for the jars again." Jessica smiled. "That's what we did back home. I haven't been able to find any jars around the house though." Mr. Gunderson took a moment to add up their total. "Is that all? I could double the jars real easy." Jessica considered for a moment and then nodded. She had a lot of berries and hoped that jam would please her new sisters. She was getting a lot of help from them and was happy to share what she could. "Thank you for all your help, Mr. Gunderson." "Of course. Give me a few moments, and I'll get everything carried outside for you, Mrs. Fleming." Jessica went out to the wagon. "Mr. Gunderson is bringing out my purchases. I also asked for jars to do the canning that I plan to do." He shook his head. "Just as long as you're not spending frivolously. You'll find I try not to spend much. I'm buying food, jars for the canning I'll do, and fabric to sew for Nancy. And the sewing machine, but you'll see how quickly it will pay for itself. I could even sew for others for a little extra money if you want. I'm quite good and fast when I need to be. As my wife, you and the children will be supported by me. No more talk of saving me money." He looked annoyed as he gave her a hand onto the wagon seat before handing her little Sally. While she held the baby, he disappeared into the store, coming out with 2 of the boxes of jars she'd requested. For the next few minutes, he helped Mr. Gunderson load the back of the wagon with her purchases. Finally, Mr. Gunderson said, "That's everything. You're all set." "Thank you again, Mr. Gunderson," Jessica called. "You are allowed to make purchases for our family," George said on the drive home. "You don't have to check with me, unless we don't have the money you need on the account. And if we don't, just go across the street to Gustafson's and get what you want there. I like Gunderson's better, but only because they usually have a better variety of meat." "And you have an account at Gustafson's as well?" "I do. I sell milk to both stores." "I see." She was quite curious about the process. "You don't use a dairy?" George nodded. "I do, but both stores have asked for fresh milk straight from the cows, so that's what I deliver." "How many cows do you have?" she asked. "Enough that I have 3 men come to help me milk at 5 in the morning and again at 5 in the evening. You'd be surprised at how hard it is to milk a barn full of dairy cows. I'm surprised you don't have little Bertie go out with you when you milk. It would be good practice for him." George nodded. "I used to do that. Everything became too hard when Heather died. I'm very sorry for your loss. I cannot imagine losing someone I love so much." George nodded but didn't look at her again as they drove home. When they arrived, he let the family out, carrying in the meat she'd purchased. "I'm going to get help to unload the wagon. Decide where you want your sewing machine." Jessica hurried into the house with the children and went to the parlor. She put the baby on the floor with her brother and pushed the sofa slightly to the right, making space for the machine. She couldn't wait to show Nancy and teach her to use it. Hurrying into the kitchen, she quickly put the meat away, and then made sandwiches for George to take with him. She'd noticed he didn't come home during the day to eat, and when he did come home at the end of his day, he was always hungry. Putting the sandwiches in an oilcloth bag, she waited on the front porch to explain where she wanted everything. The men made short work of unloading the wagon, while Jessica kept the children out of the way of the men working. When George went to leave to do the work he needed to do for the day, Jessica handed him the bag with the sandwiches. "What's this?" "Sandwiches with the leftover beef from our roast the other night. I thought it would help you to have your lunch with you during the day." He looked down at the bag and then back at her. "Thank you." As he walked out of the house, he thought about how very thoughtful his new wife was. She was a truly kind person. Perhaps he was wrong to dismiss her as a potential wife. Mary Sue came that day, shortly before noon. She had leftover stew with Jessica and the children, and then she got them down for their nap. While Mary Sue listened for the children, Jessica made up a batch of jam. She used the raspberries and the blackberries together to create a new taste, canning what was left in pint jars. When the children arrived home from school, Mary Sue woke the smaller children and went to her own home knowing she would have some jam on Sunday. Jessica had decided to take 2 jars of jam for each sister-in-law, and she would pick more berries that weekend. The apples could wait a little longer, as they would continue to ripen for a month. Jessica let each of the children have a slice of bread with jam to see how it had turned out. She knew she liked it, but letting someone else decide if it was good was always better. Nancy frowned when her bread was gone. "There's no more?" she asked. Jessica laughed. "There's lots more, but you and I are going to make jam rolls tomorrow for dessert." "I've never had a jam roll." "You'd never had apple cake either," Jessica reminded her. Finally, Nancy nodded. "I like everything you cook. I'm sure I'll like jam rolls." "Tomorrow, we're picking berries. Some of them are getting overripe, and I don't want any to go to waste." "That will be fun," Nancy said. "It should only take an hour or two, and we'll work on your new dresses for the rest of the day. Come with me, and see what your pa let me buy at the store this morning." Nancy walked with Jessica to the parlor. "What is it?" Nancy asked, staring wide-eyed at the contraption. "It's a sewing machine," Jessica said. "I'll be sewing your new dresses on it. I think I could get a whole dress sewn for church on Sunday if I work hard at it." She held up the new yellow fabric she'd purchased. "Would you like this fabric for Sunday or for school?" "Sunday," Nancy said, looking at the fabric excitedly. "You're really going to make me a new dress?" "2 new dresses," Jessica corrected. "I'll do everything I can to get it ready for you to wear on Sunday." "Oh, that will be wonderful." Nancy spun in a circle, letting her skirt flare out around her. Jessica couldn't help but notice that she really was bursting at the seams. It was time for the girl to have a dress that fit. Supper was on the table when George came in from milking a short while later. Along with the chicken pot pie she'd made, she put a bowl of jam on the table to be eaten with the fresh bread that had just come out of the oven. George eyed the feast, a slow smile crossing his face. "Did you make that jam?" Jessica nodded. "From the berries behind the barn. This is a mix of raspberry and blackberry, but we'll pick some more tomorrow, and I'll also make raspberry jam and blackberry jam. It's my little way of paying back your sisters for the food they'll share with us." George shook his head. "You work hard." Jessica shrugged, brushing off what was obviously meant as a compliment. "I believe that idle hands really are the devil's playground." "I guess you're right about that. I also baked a loaf of bread for each of your sisters. I will fill a small crate for each of them with jam, bread, and a few apples. Then hopefully by next week, we'll have more types of jam and applesauce to share. I feel like they're feeding us with their hard work, so I can feed them with mine." George felt himself warming up to Jessica even more. She was pretty, but she was a great deal more than that. She cared about his children and was working hard to have something to reciprocate for his sister's hard work, though she'd never been asked to. She was a good wife. They ate their meal and had jam on bread as a dessert. George took one bite and closed his eyes as he savored the taste. "This jam is delicious." "I don't want you to share it." Jessica laughed. "There are plenty more berries. We'll have more jam soon." As soon as George left for work on Saturday, Jessica put the younger children in a wagon, while she, Bertie, and Nancy each carried a pail for picking berries. Bertie picked blackberries, Nancy picked raspberries, and Jessica found all that the children missed, planning to make more of the mixed berry jam and even some pie filling. As they walked back to the house, Jessica felt that they'd picked all they could from the berry bushes. Soon, she could move on to the apples. She was so happy to stay busy. She and Nancy spent the morning cutting out Nancy's dress and fitting it to her. When Mary Sue arrived just before noon, she cared for the smaller children while Nancy and Jessica spent the afternoon sewing. As Nancy didn't know how to handle the sewing machine, Jessica gave her the job of hand sewing the little things that couldn't be done on the machine. Mary Sue watched them while the little ones napped. "I've never actually seen a sewing machine used," Mary Sue said. "It's so fast." Jessica nodded. "And I have sewing to do for all 4 children, and I've noticed George needs some new shirts as well." This sewing machine will be a real time saver. Then I'll have more time for what I really love. Cooking. Well, I may be begging you to let me come over with my sewing to use it. No need to beg. Anytime I'm not using it, you have my permission to use it yourself. Mary Sue smiled. I thought I'd be teaching you about sewing and cooking, and here you are, teaching me all kinds of things. I'm so glad you're here, Jessica. I appreciate your help with the children. Jessica removed the mostly finished dress from the machine. Now we just need to hem it, and it's done. I'm going to have you teach me to use that thing. Nancy smiled, hugging the dress to her. It's beautiful, Jessica. I think so too. Chapter 7. Everyone was happy with Jessica's jam rolls for dessert. Not a crumb was left when they were finished with the meal. I'll have to make those more often, she said as she cleared the table. Every night would work for me, George told her, a twinkle in his eye that she hadn't seen before. I don't know about every night, Jessica said with a laugh. But I'll try to do them at least once a month or so. Are you going to make apple jelly? Nancy asked. You know, I hadn't thought of apple jelly. Maybe we could make some next weekend. Would you like to help? Nancy smiled, nodding emphatically. Jessica and Nancy did the dishes together, and once they were finished, Nancy tried on her new dress. Jessica smiled. It was the first dress for a girl she'd made, and it had turned out beautifully. I'll work on the other dress just as soon as I've harvested and processed all the apples. I'm just happy to have a new church dress, Nancy said, twirling before running into the parlor to show her father. George smiled as his oldest child spun around for him to see the way her skirt flared. It's beautiful. Just like my little girl. Jessica walked into the room just in time to hear his praise, and she smiled to see Nancy hugging him. George seemed to be softening now that he wasn't as stressed about when the house would be clean and where their next meal would come from. Jessica and George put the children to bed together and retreated down the stairs. Let's go for a walk, George suggested. Jessica was surprised. But the children? Nancy will take care of things. She's old enough. George didn't wait for an answer, but walked toward the front door, holding his hand out for hers. Jessica was surprised to see the gesture. He'd only touched her a couple of times since the wedding, and both were to help her in and out of the wagon. When she put her hand in his large one, he folded his fingers around hers, holding hers tightly. Once they were outside, he spoke. You've done so much in the short time you've been here. I want you to know I notice and appreciate everything you do. Jessica smiled. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. He headed toward the apple trees that stood in a line along a road where only wagons on the farm went. I know my actions may appear strange, but I love my children. Sometimes it's hard to look at them because they remind me so much of their mother. I can understand that, Jessica said. It must be hard to have 4 little constant reminders of her. It is. But that doesn't mean I don't care about them or what happens to them. I understand. I know I must seem gruff and uncaring at times, but it seems as if I've been living with fog surrounding my brain for months. He didn't wait for her to speak and continued. Somehow, you've woken me up, and I want to be with my children more. Everything is clean now, and I'm not as stressed as I was before you arrived. You've made my life and the lives of the children better by being here. Thank you, Jessica said softly. He stopped walking and turned to her. He hadn't thought about needing a sexual companion since before Heather's death, but he really looked at her for a moment. She was the prettiest woman he'd seen in a long time. He leaned down and quickly brushed his lips across hers, waiting to see how she'd react. Jessica felt that this may be her only chance to be close to her new husband, and she wrapped her arms around him and kissed him back, losing herself in the passion of his touch. Neither of them said anything else as they stood, kissing, and then their clothes fell to the ground. There, under the full September moon, they became one. When it was over, Jessica felt happy that her new husband was finally accepting her as his wife. He said nothing as he rolled to her side and stared up at the moon. Finally, he started gathering clothing. He dressed quickly and dropped her clothes on her, still not saying a word. They walked back to the house, though he no longer sought to hold her hand. When they were again in the parlor, he said, "That shouldn't have happened. I won't touch you again." With those words, he turned and climbed the stairs, going to his room, leaving her standing in the middle of the house, tears flowing down her cheeks. For a short while, she'd actually believed there could be more to their relationship than just her taking care of the children, but that was obviously a mistake on her part. He had no desire to be her husband. Once again, he was making a mockery of their marriage. Jessica slept little that night. She tossed and turned, and George's rejection of her haunted the little sleep she did get. She rose early, and made eggs, biscuits, and sausage gravy for their breakfast. She carefully put together the little crates she'd made for all of the sisters who were helping her with food, and one more for George's mother. She was surprised she hadn't seen a bit more of her mother-in-law, but she was certain the older woman had things to catch up on at home after spending so much time with her grandchildren. The crates were ready before anyone descended the stairs for breakfast. She was pleased with how they looked, but the back of her mind wouldn't stop thinking about George and the way he'd made love with her, just to tell her it could never happen again when he was finished. Her mother had talked to her about men's needs, and she had no doubt she'd simply been a warm body to spend his seat in. George was the first to come down the stairs, but said nothing as he went outside to milk the cows. She didn't know if he had help on the weekends, but she didn't ask. What difference did it make? He cared nothing about her, so she should care nothing about him. But she did. She had no idea why, but she definitely did. After breakfast, there was time to do the dishes, before Nancy dashed upstairs to put her new dress on. Jessica also changed into the dress she'd made for her wedding to George that she hadn't been allowed to change into. But she felt pretty when she was ready in her new lavender dress. She changed the baby into a pretty little dress. Thankfully, the baby had plenty of clothes that had belonged to her older sister. There was no need to begin sewing for her immediately. Once everyone was ready in their church clothes, Jessica carried the baskets she'd made out to the wagon. There were 8, and one of them had extra jam in it. That one was for Mary Sue, because of all the time she'd spent trying to make Jessica's transition smooth. All of the children sat in the back of the wagon amid the crates, except for Sally, of course. She rode on Jessica's lap. Jessica wasn't sure how she was going to feel being introduced to so many new people on so little sleep, but she knew she had to make an effort. She couldn't very well announce that her new husband had hurt her feelings, so she hadn't slept enough to be civil. Mary Sue spent all of the time before the sermon introducing Jessica to her new sisters. Each one told her of food they had in her wagon for their family. None of the others had children as young as George's, but some still had older children at home. The sermon was about love. A man's love for his wife and children, to be exact. Jessica felt George prickling beside her, and she wanted to lean into him to remind him that she was the wife he was supposed to love. Of course, she didn't, because that would seem as if she was desperate for his love. Desperate or not, he would never know how she felt. After the service was over, the other Fleming women brought all different kinds of vegetables to George's wagon. Each time a woman gave her a basket full of produce, she gave them the crate with bread and jam. It felt good not to just be taking from the others and have something to share in return. Even though Mother Fleming didn't have anything for her, Jessica happily gave a crate to the older woman. "Thank you for taking care of the children until I arrived." Mother Fleming looked shocked by the gesture. "They're my grandchildren," she said. "I know they are, but it was still a lot of work, and George and I appreciate all you've done for us." "You're welcome," Mother Fleming finally said. Once all of the other crates had been given away, Jessica took the crate from Mary Sue and gave it to the other woman. "You get more jam than anyone else, because you've been so kind." Mary Sue hugged Jessica. "Thank you. You know I love your cooking. Perhaps George will consent to you and Maynard coming for supper on Saturday night. That would thrill me. I'll be there tomorrow to do your ironing. I'll make sure everything is washed today then." It wasn't noon yet, so Jessica was certain she could dry it all before bedtime. Hopefully, George would consent to watch the children while she did laundry and made up some pie filling with the berries they'd picked the previous day. When they returned home, Jessica made sandwiches for lunch. It wasn't anything special, but it was filling, and there were so many other things she needed to do. While they ate, Jessica decided not to give George a choice about minding the children. "I need to do the laundry and make some pie filling today. I want to get the filling canned and more jam made before the berries go bad. So I'll need you to mind the children while I do that." George looked surprised, but nodded. "You're not taking the day off?" Jessica wanted to roll her eyes, but she restrained herself. "I've already made 2 meals today. Women don't get Sundays off. I'm not sure if you've noticed." Her voice was sharper than she'd meant for it to be, but she was very frustrated by the situation with George. As soon as they were finished with lunch, Jessica and Nancy washed the dishes together, and to Jessica's surprise, Nancy went outside with Jessica to do the laundry. "You don't have to help," Jessica said, thinking she'd really rather be alone as she took care of the laundry. "I want to help. Is that all right?" Nancy asked. Jessica put on a bright smile. "You know I'll always accept help." So Jessica washed and rinsed the clothes, and then Nancy hung them on the line. It made the task go faster, and gave them a chance to talk. Nancy had changed from her new dress as soon as they'd gotten home from church. "Everyone was talking about how pretty I look in my new dress today," Nancy said. "Thank you." "You're welcome. I'll make your other one as soon as I deal with all the food in the back of the wagon and the berries and the apples." Nancy giggled. "It's a lot, isn't it?" "It really is. But I'll get it done. Your Aunt Mary Sue is going to come over again tomorrow to help me out. And I'm making her and your Uncle Maynard chicken and dumplings for their supper." "And for us too?" Nancy asked. "Do you already want chicken and dumplings again?" Jessica asked, surprised. Nancy nodded. "Yes, because they were delicious." "All right, I'll make chicken and dumplings for everyone." It would certainly make her day easier if she only cooked 1 meal for supper, not 2. "May I help with making the pie filling?" Nancy asked. Jessica nodded. "Of course, you may. I'd love to have you for anything you want to help with." "Good. I've never made pie filling. Is it hard?" "Not too hard. I'll show you how, and we'll start writing down receipts for you. Every girl should have a receipt book she can cook from when she marries." "And we can start mine now?" Nancy asked, her eyes wide. "Absolutely," Jessica said. She loved that Nancy was so excited to have a receipt book. It was good to have a child interested in what you were teaching them. Because of the work she put into the pie filling, Jessica made a simple soup for supper. She used the vegetables given to her earlier that day and made a big pot of chicken soup for the family. While the soup simmered, Jessica and Nancy worked on the pie filling. She had 2 huge pots going, one with raspberry and one with blackberry. Nancy sat at the kitchen table and wrote down each ingredient as Jessica added it to the pots. She quickly rolled out 2 pie crusts and explained each ingredient as she did, giving Nancy more information for her book of receipts. She combined the 2 different types of berries for the pies she was making, one for her family and one for Maynard and Mary Sue. When she popped them into the oven, Nancy rubbed her hand. "I hate writing that much all at once." Jessica laughed. "The higher you get in school, the more they'll make you write." Nancy groaned. I wish you hadn't told me that. When it was time to put supper on the table, Jessica put the pie she'd made along with the soup, bread, and butter. Can we have more jam? Bertie asked. Jessica smiled. Of course, we can. I'll get it from the icebox. George didn't try to converse with Jessica, and instead glowered at everyone. Jessica would have thought he'd be happier after making love with her, but rather, he seemed more annoyed with everyone than ever. After supper, instead of immediately starting the dishes as was her habit, Jessica took Nancy outside, and the two of them pulled the clothes off the line and put them into laundry baskets. When they were done, she sighed with relief. Now Aunt Mary Sue can iron them all tomorrow. And we get chicken and dumplings. Jessica laughed softly and nodded. I like them a lot too. Chapter 8. By late October, the apples had been processed and distributed to various family members. Jessica was able to put up all the vegetables she'd received as well. Nancy's second dress had been made, and she wore it to school with pride. All of the children had warmed up to Jessica, but their father was still difficult. He had no desire to be close to Jessica in any way, and it made her seriously consider going back to Beckham, where at least she was wanted. But she couldn't leave the children. She was attracted to George, but deeply in love with the 4 children. Sally was sitting on her own and crawling all over. Mary Sue still came over at least once a week to iron the laundry, but usually more often. Jessica enjoyed providing suppers for Mary Sue and Maynard. It made her feel that something she did was worthwhile, even though George rarely showed any appreciation. Mary Sue came over to help with the children one afternoon and found Jessica sitting on the sofa in the parlor, which was rare. Jessica was always doing something constructive, but simply staring off into space was unlike her. Are you all right? Mary Sue asked. I don't know. Jessica looked up at her friend. I haven't been feeling like myself. What's wrong? Mary Sue asked, immediately taking a seat beside Jessica on the sofa. Jessica sighed, looking down at her hands. I have been throwing up whenever I change a dirty diaper. It's never bothered me before, and now suddenly, I can't keep my lunch in me. And I've gotten dizzy a few times while doing my chores. Mary Sue smiled, but just a bit. You're expecting? Jessica shook her head. No, George and I don't have that kind of relationship. Not even once? Mary Sue asked, feeling as if she was prying. Jessica blushed. Once, but it was when I first got here. That's just about the right time to start having symptoms. We should get you to the doctor in town, just to be sure. Jessica shook her head. I'd rather see a midwife if you think that's necessary. I do think it is. I'm going to run and fetch Mrs. Doherty. She's the best midwife in the whole state of Wisconsin. Jessica nodded. While you're gone, I'll put supper in the oven. She was planning to bake potatoes with roast beef and gravy, topping them. It was something her mother had made during the winters, and it was getting cold enough for them to appreciate a hot meal. While Mary Sue rode for the midwife, Jessica put supper in the oven and 2 loaves of bread. She had a pie crust ready for apple pie filling, and she'd bake that as soon as the bread was done. Thankfully the children were quiet, and before she knew it, Mary Sue was back with the midwife. Alice, this is my sister-in-law, Jessica. Jessica, this is Alice Doherty, the midwife I spoke to you about. Mrs. Doherty sat down on the sofa beside Jessica. Mary Sue tells me she thinks you may be expecting. Can you tell me about your symptoms? 30 minutes later, after several questions and a brief exam, Mrs. Doherty said, I have to agree with Mary Sue. I think you're expecting. I'd say about 7.5 months from now. Jessica frowned. It was the last thing she'd wanted to hear. She wanted her own children, but not with a man who would barely look at her. How on earth was she supposed to tell George she was expecting when it was obvious it was not what he wanted? While Mary Sue was out taking Mrs. Doherty home, Jessica took the bread from the oven and added the pies. She sincerely hoped that George wasn't going to yell at her again. It seemed to be the only way he wanted to speak with her. When Mary Sue returned, Jessica asked her just that. "How am I going to tell George? He's going to find a way for everything to be my fault. I didn't realize things were still so awkward between you and George. I'd hoped you were getting on better." "I would hope so as well, but it's not the case. He seems thankful for everything I do for him and the children, but he doesn't desire to have me as a wife. Just a servant." Mary Sue frowned. "Well, that's not right. If he wanted a servant, he should have advertised for a servant, not a wife." "I agree. But that's not how things were done, and it's too late now. I've thought several times about going home in the last month, but I couldn't bear to leave the children." The front door banged open, and Jessica smiled. "All right, you too. Bread and butter for your after-school snack." "Do you make them a snack every day?" Mary Sue asked, shaking her head. "You spoil them." Jessica shrugged. "I enjoy spoiling them." She got up and went into the kitchen to put the bread and butter on the table for the older children. "I'll go wake the little ones," she said. Mary Sue smiled. "Let me get the little ones. You could do with a snack yourself, I think." Jessica knew her friend was right. She did need a snack. She sat down with the children, and they had bread, butter, and cold glasses of milk for their snack. "Can I help make supper?" Nancy asked. She had yet to change into her play clothes, but Jessica let them snack first usually. "It's already in the oven." "What are we having?" Nancy seemed disappointed not to be able to help. "Something my mother used to make. Baked potatoes with roast beef and gravy served over them. It's perfect for the cool weather we're having." Nancy nodded. "Sounds good." "I think so too. And I have apple pie in the oven for dessert." "I like apple pie," Bertie said. "Me too." Mary Sue came downstairs with a disheveled-looking Sally and Joe following behind her. "I'll get Sally her bottle," Mary Sue said. "I don't know how much longer she's going to be content with as much milk as she drinks." Jessica agreed. She enjoys real food more than the milk, but she still finds the milk comforting. "The goat is giving less and less milk daily, so we may have to switch her to cow's milk soon." Mary Sue carried Sally close to the table, and she leaned over to try to grab Jessica. Jessica laughed, taking the baby from her friend. "Did you have a good nap, sweet girl?" Jessica kissed the baby's forehead as she popped the nipple into her mouth. "You know she doesn't talk, right?" Joe asked. Joe had said the same thing at least twice a week since her arrival, and she answered how she always did. "She doesn't talk now, but she will soon if we keep talking to her." Joe looked at her as if she'd lost her mind, but Jessica didn't mind. She had a real fondness for little Joe. "Can we play outside until supper time?" Nancy asked. She'd gotten good about watching her siblings after school. Jessica nodded. "But it's cold out there, so we all must bundle up." "I'm ready for winter," Nancy announced. "I miss taking sleigh rides." "The snow will be here soon enough," Jessica told her. "Then we'll wish it was hot so we could play outside more." "Not me," Nancy said. "I like playing outside all winter." When the children went out to play, Jessica cleared the table from their snack, washed the few dishes, and set the table for supper. "You are always cooking," Mary Sue said. "I worry you're going to do too much while you're in the family way." "Oh, don't worry about me. I'm strong as an ox. Just pray that George doesn't lose his mind when I tell him my news." "He won't. He's always been excited at the idea of each new child. I can't imagine him being upset. He was always in love with his wife for each new child," Jessica reminded the older woman. Mary Sue hugged her. I'm heading out. I'll be by tomorrow, and you can tell me how it went. Jessica returned to doing the last few things to prepare for supper, including getting the pie from the oven. Her pies were never quite as pretty as her mother's, but they always tasted better. She'd trade pretty for better taste any day. On a whim, she mixed some brown sugar with melted butter to make a caramel sauce to go over the pie. She would have liked ice cream with it as well, but she'd only had ice cream a few times in her life, and she had no idea how to make it. The children came inside with George, each of them going to wash their hands, and George carrying Sally to wash hers. He laughed as she splashed water all over the front of him, obviously in a fine mood for a change. Once everything was on the table, George frowned. I've never seen this mixture of food. It's something my mother used to make all the time. She cut open her own potato, and poured a helping of the roast beef and gravy over the top, putting some carrots on the side. There. She did the same for Joe's plate, and let the older children fix their own. As usual, she shared her meal with Sally. George looked skeptical, but he spooned the roast beef over his own potatoes, and then tried a bite. Oh, this is delicious. Jessica nodded. It's one of my favorite meals. I can see why. While they ate, the children talked about their day at school, while George laughed with them at the funny stories. Jessica was surprised to see George so happy, but she was thankful that he was in this sort of mood when she needed to give him her news. Once the children were in bed, Jessica returned to the parlor where George was again reading the Farmer's Almanac. I need to talk to you about something, she said softly. It's going to be a harsh winter according to the almanac, he said. We'll manage. She took a deep breath. I haven't been feeling well lately. I saw Mrs. Doherty today, and I'm expecting. His eyes widened for a moment, and his face fell. Are you certain? She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She so desperately wanted him to be happy about the baby, and in love with the baby's mother. No matter how he'd treated her in the past 6 weeks, she fell a little more in love with him daily. She didn't know what that said about her, and she didn't want to. George took a deep breath and let it out. Well, I guess we'll have a baby then, won't we? He didn't look altogether pleased with the news, but he wasn't yelling at her either. I wish we wouldn't have 2 in diapers at the same time, but there doesn't seem to be anything to be done about it, Jessica said. I'm sorry this happened. There's no blame for it. We'll just manage. He rubbed the back of his neck. I'll dig the cradle out of the barn in case you want to paint it. I'd appreciate that. She had no idea whether or not she wanted to paint the cradle, but it was always nice to have options. I'll order some flannel for diapers the next time I go to the store. That's a good idea. It's not like we won't need them. George had no idea what to say to Jessica. He wasn't unhappy about a new baby, but wasn't over the moon either. He'd been unfaithful to Heather with his new wife, and he still regretted it, especially as he fell further and further under her spell as the days went by. Do you need help around the house? How sick are you? She shrugged. Changing diapers is the hardest thing for me. I'm vomiting a lot, but I think I'll be fine on my own. Besides, Mary Sue comes by most days to at least free me up to do whatever needs to be done in the afternoons. It's nice to throw myself into a project and know she'll care for the children if they wake early. He nodded. I'm glad she does that then. Me too. Jessica wanted to throw herself into his arms and sob her heart out, but he'd never once indicated that he was willing to accept any type of display of emotion from her. Instead, she sat on the sofa, trying to blink back the tears. When nothing else had been said 5 minutes later, she mumbled. I'm turning in. See you in the morning. She got up and half ran up the stairs to the sanctity of the bathroom where she wept. As she lay abed trying to sleep, Her mind went back to the fantasies she'd had of him opening his arms to her at the train station and immediately knowing she was the woman he needed in his life. Instead, she told him she was expecting, and all he said was they'd deal with it. What kind of man married a woman, made love with her only one time, and showed no emotion toward her whatsoever? A man who is still in love with his late wife, a tiny voice responded. A man who has no desire to have you in his life at all other than for you to cook, clean, and mind the children. Wake up and smell the coffee. It's time you grew up and give up on your childish dreams of having your husband fall in love with you. It's not going to happen. Unfortunately, Jessica knew the little voice in her head was correct. George had no use for her other than the work she did. He didn't see her as a wife at all. Instead, he saw her as a servant he'd made a mistake with. How on earth was she going to be able to go on feeling as she did? She decided to write her mother the following morning and get the advice of the person she trusted most. In all her letters, she'd glazed over how George felt, and instead, she'd talked about the children and everything she was doing to keep busy. It was time to tell her mother everything. Chapter 9. When Jessica woke the following morning, she was in a very different frame of mind than when she'd gone to bed. She no longer wanted to tell her mother about everything that was going on in her life and decided it was best to play it safe and keep up the pretense of a good marriage with everyone. George would be the only one who knew the truth. Well, George and Mary Sue, but she would tell Mary Sue all was well. There was no reason to tell her any differently. When she went down to fix breakfast, she acted as if everything was fine, and she knew she needed to continue acting that way. Now that she was expecting, there was no way she could leave her marriage, not that she could have with as much as she loved George's children. She made a breakfast casserole using up the last of the bread she'd made 2 days before. It was a trick her mother had taught her, and she preferred the casseroles to French toast, which always tasted just a bit too sweet for breakfast to her. When she served the casserole, George eyed it suspiciously. "What's in that?" Jessica shook her head. "All the things you eat for breakfast every day. Eggs, bread, sausage, and I topped it with a little country gravy." George looked unsure about the food, but he waited for her to finish serving it before praying and trying a bite. The children seemed to be watching his reaction, to see if they should even try the strange concoction. "This is really good," he finally said. Then the children began eating their own. Jessica fed the baby a bite, and she seemed happy as well. "You all need to start trusting my cooking," she said softly. George nodded. "I agree. I'm sorry." Jessica spent most of the day baking. She made bread, cookies, and a cake. There was a church social that evening, and she wanted to take something that would be eaten quickly. She finally decided to make her roast beef with gravy and a separate helping of mashed potatoes to eat it over. Who didn't love roast beef with mashed potatoes? Nancy assisted her in the kitchen, the two of them making sure everything was just right. There was to be a short auction at the church to raise money for a new roof. There had been some leaks, and it badly needed to be fixed before snow settled on the roof and made everything harder. Meanwhile, George went through his daily chores, thinking about the baby Jessica carried. Every time Heather had been pregnant, they'd rejoiced in a new life on the way. Jessica had been certain he would be angry with her, as if she'd somehow gotten into the family way on her own. He spent the whole day thinking of her, and how he'd treated her as if she was less important, simply because he'd loved another first. By the time he was done with the second milking of the day, George knew he had to make some changes. He had a mental conversation with Heather as he milked the cows, knowing he couldn't speak to a dead woman with his hired hands right there. "Heather, I've loved you since we were both children, and I've kept your memory alive for both myself and our children. But little Sally is 8 months old now, and I've married again. I married Jessica because I needed a mother for the children and someone to keep house. I was certain I would be able to live with her and have no feelings at all, but things have changed. Jessica is a good woman who loves our children as if they were her own. I've never seen a woman take to her husband's children as Jessica has. I must confess we had one night together. She was making the children so happy, and she's such a pleasant woman. Well, I'm sure you understand what that led to. She's expecting now, and she's still sleeping in the baby's room with her, as if she's a servant. I can't continue to treat her as a servant, though. Even if it means betraying your memory, I have to start treating her as a wife. Tonight, I'll be moving her into our bedroom, and I will treat her as I should have treated her all along. You've always been such a generous and kind woman yourself that I know you would be disappointed in the way I've treated Jessica, but all that ends now. She will be treated as a wife, the same as I treated you. I love you more than I could ever express, but I do believe it's time for me to move on, and allow Jessica to be a real wife to me, not a servant. I hope you won't mind that she is sleeping in our bed and taking care of our babies. When he heard the words, "Love her as you did me," behind him, he was certain he was imagining things, but it sounded just like his beloved Heather. Suddenly he felt free. Free to love his new wife. Free to get to know her. And free to have her in his bed. He whispered a soft, "Thank you." When he went into the house after hitching up the wagon, Jessica was waiting with the children all in their Sunday best. He hurried upstairs to change, and then carried the baby out to the wagon for Jessica, not wanting her to have to put any undue strain on her body while she was expecting. He knew it was silly, but it made him feel better to help her the little he could, knowing she would be holding the baby through the day every day. He helped Jessica into the wagon and tucked the blanket around her and Sally to make certain they stayed warm. Nancy and Bertie had carried their offerings for the church social outside, and he was just climbing up onto his seat when she said, "I almost forgot. I have a crate of jams, jellies, and applesauce on the kitchen table to be auctioned off." He nodded and hurried inside to get the crate. His wife had already become known through the area for her wonderful cooking, and he knew the crate would help them with the roof for the church. He put the crate in the back and climbed onto the seat beside Jessica, picking up the leads. Thankfully, it was a short drive to the church, and then they would be warm as they spent the evening inside. When they arrived at the church, Jessica couldn't help but smile excitedly. All of the pews had been pushed up against the walls, and they were set as places for people to sit while they ate the wonderful food offered. There would even be a couple of men playing instruments so the rest of them could dance. For the first time, she looked forward to a dance, though she didn't know why. It wasn't as if George would dance with her. The Fleming family took up half the church congregation and gathered together for the evening. As soon as a prayer was offered for their meal, they got in line to choose their food. Mary Sue held her hands out for Sally. "You go pick your food first. I don't want you to have to eat something that could upset your stomach," she said to Jessica. Jessica opened her mouth to argue, but realized Mary Sue was right. She needed nourishment that pleased her stomach, or she would end up outside later, trying to keep her food in her. She helped little Joe choose food as she chose her own. When they moved back to sit down and eat, she took the baby back from Mary Sue and fed her from her own plate. Jessica had been careful to fill her plate with everything she saw. She wasn't worried about making her queasy, hoping she wouldn't hurt feelings as she went along. To her surprise, George sat beside her, rather than gathering with the other men. "You don't have to stay with me," she told him. "I'll mind the children while you spend time with your brothers." George shook his head. "Not tonight." Jessica said nothing else about it. She wasn't going to try to push him away. After their meal, she saw that 2 other women in the family had put down a quilt to allow their babies to be together and not have to be held all night. Jessica carried Sally over and asked if she could play with the others. No one in the family had been overly friendly with Jessica other than Mary Sue. Even Mother Fleming barely glanced at her. "Of course, she can play with the others," Allison, the wife of the second youngest son, Peter, said. "Thank you." Jessica set the baby on the floor with the others. Jessica returned to her seat, where she could easily keep an eye on the baby, but on the other 3 children as well. George took her hand in his when she sat beside him. She looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "You don't have to pretend to care for me," she whispered, hoping no one else would notice. "You're my wife. It's time you were treated as such." Jessica wasn't sure if that was a good sign or not, but he certainly hadn't claimed to care about her, which pleased her. He shouldn't have to pretend to have feelings where there were none. Each of the offerings was quickly auctioned off, and Jessica was pleased her crate of goodies went for $5 whole. She wanted to protest that it wasn't worth that much, but who would she be protesting to? It made more sense to sit quietly. As soon as the music started, George looked into Jessica's eyes. "Dance with me." Jessica nodded, uncertain what he was up to, but she knew it was something. Surely he wasn't about to start treating her like a real wife. She'd thought that was happening once and had been completely fooled by him. She didn't want to go through all that again. George quickly swept her into his arms, dancing close as the band played a slow waltz. "I have a gramophone," he said. "I should get it out and we can dance together at home as well." She smiled. That would be nice. But in her mind, she wondered how long his new attitude would last. He certainly hadn't lasted long the last time. One evening seemed to be his limit for how long he could pretend to like her. Jessica noticed that Nancy was dancing with a boy, and she smiled. "Is that Johnny?" she whispered to George. George nodded. "How did you know?" "She complains about him chasing her around at recess and teasing her." "Who else would she dance with?" He grinned. Children are odd with how they show affection, aren't they? He could remember chasing Heather at recess, but he eventually found the courage to tell her how he felt. Perhaps Johnny would be able to tell Nancy someday. After the dance, Jessica returned to the pew, expecting George to go off and spend time with his brothers now that their obligatory dance was over. Instead, he stayed beside her. "I don't mind if you don't want to sit with me all evening," Jessica said. "I like where I am because I can see your beauty here. Who wants to look at my brother's scruffy faces?" Jessica wasn't sure what game he was playing, but it was starting to make her uncomfortable. She was sure it was all for show, so everyone would know his second marriage was going as well as his first. She realized he wanted to save face, just as she did with her mother. She wasn't telling her about their marital troubles, just as he wasn't letting anyone else see it. By the end of the evening, they'd danced twice more. The third time, with Sally on her hip. The baby was getting sleepy, so she rested her head on Jessica's shoulder, content to be in the arms of the only mother she'd ever known. Once they were home that evening, Jessica immediately started having the children go to bed. She was surprised when George took the baby from her and carried her up the stairs to bed. Jessica followed, changing Sally's diaper and putting her down for the night. She made sure the other children were settled in their beds, and went downstairs to where George was in the parlor. "I'm calling it a night. All the children are in bed." George stood. "I'll go up with you." "I know the way," she said, still wondering what the man was up to. He stepped close to her and brushed his lips softly against hers. "I told you earlier. It's time for you to be treated as my wife, and not as a servant. I'm sorry for my behavior." She frowned up at him. "I forgive you." But she didn't trust him. How could she? They went upstairs together, and she was surprised when he caught her hand as she was walking into Sally's room. "You're sleeping in here now." Jessica wasn't certain she even wanted to sleep with him. Oh, she loved him, but that didn't mean she trusted him not to hurt her again. "Are you certain?" she asked, still willing to walk away if he didn't want her with him. "Absolutely." He pulled her into his room, where she'd been only to collect and put away laundry and change the bedding. "My nightgown is in the baby's room," she said. "Well, go change and come to bed with me." It almost felt as if he thought he was giving her something special by letting her sleep with him. She wanted to tell him it was too little too late, but her heart wouldn't let her. She wanted to be closer to him if at all possible, and she would be now that she could. She changed into her white nightgown and went into the master bedroom. "Do you have a preferred side of the bed?" she asked. "My side is the side toward the door." "If there's a problem, I'm between you and that problem," he told her. Jessica nodded, knowing then he accepted her baby. He was obviously willing to defend it against anything. She was pleased at least part of her was wanted. Climbing under the covers, she turned toward the wall and closed her eyes. It had been a very long day, and she was sleepy. Besides, they had church in the morning, and she wasn't about to miss it. George watched her deliberately turn toward the wall, and he realized he had a lot of fences to mend before she trusted him. He wished he'd been kinder to her, but he would just have to do everything in his power to make up for it. Chapter 10. George's kindness continued for a month before Jessica could start taking it seriously. He hadn't initiated lovemaking again, and she certainly hadn't. One evening in early December, after the children had gone to bed, Jessica sat with George in the parlor. "What are your plans for tomorrow?" George asked. Jessica shrugged. "Minding the children, cooking, and the midwife is coming to check on me." "You haven't said anything about how you're feeling?" "Is the morning sickness gone?" he asked. "Do you really care?" Jessica asked. As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she regretted them. She'd tried so hard to act as though the way they now acted toward one another was the same as it had always been, but she was tired and a bit cranky. It was so hard to believe he cared even a little. "Of course, I care. You're carrying my baby." She nodded. "When you start caring for me, we'll talk." George's jaw dropped, and she left the room with his mouth still agape. She wasn't going to continue to be treated poorly, and she certainly didn't want to be treated well simply because they'd made a mistake and she was carrying his child. She changed, and climbed into their bed, making sure she stayed as close to the edge as possible. She had no desire to touch him or have him touch her. When he joined her just minutes later, she pretended to be asleep already, not wanting to have to talk to him or deal with him in any way. Just before dawn the following morning, she felt a hand in the middle of her back. "It's time to wake up," he said softly. He hadn't even tried to kiss her since the night they'd started sharing a bed, so she was surprised at his touch. Jessica didn't respond, but she swung her legs out of bed and sat up as gracefully as she could. Most people wouldn't be able to tell she was showing yet, but her stomach was hard, and she could feel the difference. "I think we need to talk," he said as she gathered her clothes to head to the bathroom and dress. Jessica shrugged. "I don't know why." He walked to her and stopped her from leaving, one hand on each shoulder. "Tonight, I'm going to take you to the diner in town. I'll get Mary Sue to watch the children." "Why?" she asked. "Because there are things that still need to be said. As soon as I'm finished milking, we'll go. It's time for us to clear the air once and for all." Jessica had been raised to be obedient to her husband, and she reluctantly agreed. "All right." George smiled, leaning down to kiss her nose. Jessica stood still, allowing him, but not truly responding. All day, Jessica could think about nothing but clearing the air with George. She wondered if she'd truly be allowed to say what she wanted to say, or if he'd cut her off and only say what he wanted to say. She had no desire to sit and hear how she was failing as a wife when she'd arrived full of hopes and dreams for a good life together, and she'd found a mockery of marriage instead. She made chicken and dumplings for supper for Mary Sue, Maynard, and the children, though she had no desire to do anything that would please George. At that moment, she wanted to get on a train back to Beckham, and she seriously considered it, but she couldn't possibly leave the children she cared for so much. After the children were home from school, she gave them their snack, and a short while later, Mary Sue and Maynard arrived. Sally went to Mary Sue readily, happy to be held by her second favorite person in the world. I don't know how long we'll be, Jessica told her friend. George says we need to air everything out. Mary Sue nodded. I agree with George. I don't want to admit it aloud, but I think I do as well. I know there are many things I need to say. Jessica looked down at her hands. I'm a little nervous about saying them. It really is time, Mary Sue said. And I'll be very happy here with the children and your chicken and dumplings. Jessica grinned. I baked a pie for you as well. That will not hurt one bit, Mary Sue said with a smile. Maynard keeps asking for more pies with the filling you made. This is the filling. I hope he enjoys it. I mixed in a few other things this time to make it taste like caramel. I've been wanting caramel apple pie, so that's what I'm making. Mary Sue laughed. I craved something different with each child. With my youngest, it was cake. I made a cake almost every day. The other children were thrilled. I'm sure they were, Jessica said with a laugh. The door opened, and both women grew quiet as George walked in. I'll change clothes and be ready in a few minutes, he told Jessica. Jessica nodded but said nothing to him. She wanted to yell, shout, and get all her anger out, but that wouldn't work. Perhaps she could do it on the way to the diner, but certainly not while they were there. Jessica served supper to her family while she waited for George. He came down the stairs shortly after she'd finished, wearing his Sunday best. Jessica was still wearing her day dress, and she saw no reason to change. She hadn't let out her other dresses to grow over her expanding belly yet. Jessica was surprised when they stepped outside, and she saw that he'd hitched a sleigh to the horses instead of the wagon. George helped her into the low-seated sleigh and tucked the blanket around her. She told herself it was for the baby. Why else would he be so kind to her? It'll take around an hour to get to the diner. Do you want to talk on the way? George asked. Jessica took a deep breath. I think I'd like to say what I want to say without an audience, so yes, that would be a good idea. I'm all ears. I don't like how you treated me when I first arrived here. I didn't come to be a servant. I came to be a wife and mother. You've never stood in the way of me being a mother to your children, but you didn't treat me as a wife until you found out I was expecting. And then overnight you change and expect me to adjust, and it's hard to trust you now. Why would I think you could ever care for me with the way you treated me when I first arrived? George listened in silence. When he realized she was finished, he said, When you arrived, I was still in mourning for my wife. Every time I saw you, it made me think of her, and for that I'm deeply sorry. I should have treated you as a beloved, valued wife from the start, but I just couldn't force myself to do so. You should have said that in your letter. The entire way here, I fantasized about you loving me from the moment you saw me. You wouldn't even look at me. Yes, I was naive, but it took you days before you really acknowledged all I was doing for the family, and then we took a walk, made love, and it was all over. Do you have any idea how dirty that made me feel? He closed his eyes for a moment and then nodded. I thought I could get past thinking of Heather every time I walked into the house, but I wasn't ready at that moment. I shouldn't have made love to you then, and I should have talked openly about how I was feeling, but how do you tell a woman you're rejecting her because there's no love left inside of you to give her? Then why are you suddenly acting as if I'm really your wife now, when I'm expecting? It makes no sense at all. The day after you told me you were going to have my child, I had a heart-to-heart with Heather. I know she wasn't really there, but it felt as if she was, and it seemed as if she gave me permission to love you as I loved her. He shook his head. Whether that makes sense to you or not, it's what happened. And I do love you, Jessica. I just had to let myself feel that way. And I'm supposed to trust you're telling the truth and not planning to toss me aside again when you feel like it later? Jessica's heart had yearned for those words from him, but now that she had them, they were nearly impossible to believe. I wish you'd believe me, he said softly, but I know it's too much to expect. He shook his head. As soon as I allowed myself to start having feelings for you, I knew I loved you. You are an amazing mother, and I'm proud to call you my wife. She sighed. I want to believe you. I've been waiting to hear those words. I know I love you, but you just haven't displayed any sort of love for me. I know. I've tried, but I know it was too little too late. All I can say is that I'm thankful for the time to get over Heather's death, but now that I'm over it, I love you with all my heart. All 4 of my children love you. Sally would rather you held her than me. Only because she's gotten more used to me since I'm the one with her all day. Same with Joe. Nancy goes to you with her troubles instead of me. And she wants to be part of whatever you're doing. Jessica shook her head. I love the children. I have since the day I arrived. That's not in question here, and their love for me isn't in question. I do what they need, so they love me. Seeing you with them makes me love you. Seeing you without them also makes me love you. You're exactly the woman we needed in our lives. The children love and respect you, and believe it or not, I do as well. I haven't mistreated you in over a month. Don't you think it's time you could start trusting me? Are you sure you love me? She asked, her voice soft. If I let myself believe and you change back to who you were when I first arrived, then I don't know how I'll be able to go on. I'm sure I love you. I'm sure I want to sit on our porch swing and watch our children and grandchildren play while holding your hand. You are so much more than I ever expected in a mail-order bride, and I thank God every day that you've come into my life. Really? She asked, needing confirmation once more. He covered her mittened hand with his own. Really? I hope you'll be able to forgive me for the way I treated you when you were first here. I do love you, Jessica. And her tears started to fall. I love you too, but I'd given up hope on you ever loving me back. His arm went around her, and he pulled her closer, kissing her head. I was attracted to you from the first moment I saw you. I kept praying you'd be ugly, and I wouldn't develop feelings, but they came much too quickly. Not for me, she said wryly, and he laughed. Santa came a little early this year. He did? He brought me the love I've been desperately praying for and needing. Thanks for making me talk it all out with you. She frowned. Do you want to go to the diner? Mary Sue said their food wasn't nearly as good as mine. There's plenty of chicken and dumplings. We're going to the diner. I never had the chance to court you properly, and this will be the start. I hope you don't mind, but I will insist you continue to sleep in my bed during our courtship process. She smiled at that. Are we good now? She asked. We couldn't be better, George said, grinning at her. And I'll do what I can to show you I love you every day of our lives. I couldn't ask for more than that. Epilogue. Jessica gave one final push and the second twin arrived. A boy and a girl, Mrs. Doherty said. Jessica lay back against the pillows, absolutely exhausted. Her labor had been faster with the twins, but it had also been harder than the others. That makes 6 of each. Who could ask for more than that? No one, Mrs. Doherty said. Jessica realized she was still squeezing Mary Sue's hand. Sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to hold on for so long. Mary Sue shook her head. You did great. I know George is outside the door pacing. Before you send him in, would you tell him there will be no more babies? 12 should be enough for anyone. I absolutely will. And this time, he'd better listen. George came into the room a short while later, and she was holding a baby in each arm. Twins. You kept telling me twins, but I didn't believe you. Please tell me 12 children is enough. He chuckled. I'm just glad you're still healthy after 12 children. I am too. Who would take care of them? He smiled. I'm sure John would let us have Nancy for a few days if absolutely necessary. Besides, Sally is here to help with whatever you need. Isn't it hard to believe our baby Sally is 16 and being courted by the boy who chased her around at recess? And our Nancy is married to the boy who chased her at recess. Our boys should be more careful of their sisters and the boys who chase them. I don't know why, Jessica said. Seems to be working out all right so far. It does indeed. He leaned over and pressed his lips to hers. What are we going to name these two? Let's name them after us. We'll have little Georgina, who we can call Gina for short, and Jessie. It seems fitting after all we've been through together. George smiled. Perfect answer. Georgina and Jessie.